The sound of the key turning in the rusty lock broke the 3-year silence of the pine forest. The heavy oak door swung open, groaning in protest at the intrusion. A gust of cold, musty air, the scent of time and neglect, rushed out to greet the returnee. Luke stepped inside. He didn't reach for the light switch. His eyes, accustomed to night marches, seemed to adapt instantly to the dim gloom within. The hard soles of his issue boots hit the wooden floor, creating dry thump sounds that echoed in the empty space. Trailing closely behind him was Gunnar, the 6-year-old German. Shepard paused at the threshold, nose lifted to sniff the air. He didn't rush into the house like a typical dog returning to his home. He moved slowly, his right hind leg slightly limping, the legacy of a shrapnel wound in Kandahar. Gunnar stayed close to the wall, ears erect, his amber eyes sweeping every dark corner as if searching for an unseen threat, or perhaps a familiar shadow he knew would never appear again. Luke unslung his military pack, letting it drop with a thud onto the floor. Dust motes rose, dancing in the weak shafts of light filtering through the window. He swept his gaze across the living room. Everything remained exactly as it had been on the day he received the death notice. Only the dust had accumulated another layer of time. He stopped in front of the upright piano that lay dormant in the corner. The red velvet cover had turned a dingy gray. Luke reached out. His calloused, rough fingers, marked by war scars, hovered over the ivory keys. He was about to press a key, just one note, to awaken this house. But his hand trembled. An uncontrollable tremor started at his fingertips and ran up his arm. He withdrew his hand as if he had touched a hot flame. On top of the piano, a wooden picture frame lay face down, the glass pressed against the wood, hiding the smile of the person in the photograph. Luke stared intently at the back of the frame, his breath catching in his chest. He reached out, intending to turn it over, but then his finger joints stiffened. He couldn't do it. He turned and walked away, leaving the frame lying there, silent as a small grave. The kitchen was colder than the living room. The chill here wasn't just temperature. It was the absence of warmth and fire. Luke opened the refrigerator. Empty. Only a sour smell of stagnant air remained. His eyes fell on the wall calendar next to the window. The calendar, showing snow-capped mountains, was still open to October. October 14th. 3 years ago, the day his mother drew her last breath in the district hospital, alone, while he was trapped in a sandstorm on the other side of the globe. The rage flared up, hot and sudden. Luke ripped the calendar from the wall. The tearing sound was as jarring as the sharp rip of a bandage. He crumpled the paper in his palm, squeezing so hard his nails dug painfully into his flesh. He threw the paper ball into the corner. It rolled harmlessly, pathetic and vulnerable. All clear, old man. Luke spoke, his voice hoarse from disuse. Gunnar came out of the bedroom, his tail low. He didn't settle on the soft sheepskin rug by the fireplace. Instead, he went straight to the main door, laid down on the cold wooden floor, his head facing outwards, his front paws stretched out in a ready-to-spring position. His eyes didn't fully close. He was still on guard. The war might have ended with his discharge papers, but for Gunnar, the mission to protect was never over. Luke sighed, his breath condensing into a thin white plume. He didn't light a fire. He didn't deserve that warmth. He sat on the cracked leather sofa, pulled out an MRE ration, tore open the packaging, and began to chew. The bland taste of industrial food slid down his throat, leaving nothing but the mechanical sensation of a full stomach. Outside, the wind began to howl. The old pine trees surrounding the house writhed, their branches clashing together with an eerie, rustling sound. The sky darkened rapidly. A violent, unseasonal, and merciless blizzard was swallowing the Rockies. Night descended deep, bringing a bone-chilling cold. The wooden house shook violently with every gust of wind. Snow rattled against the window pane like a barrage of tiny pebbles. Luke sat in the dark, his pistol on the side table within easy reach. He couldn't sleep. Sleep was a luxury that recurring nightmares always came to collect payment for. Suddenly, Gunnar sprang to his feet. It wasn't the usual lazy rise. Every muscle in the dog's body was taut as a wire. The fur on his hackles stood straight up. He lunged to the edge of the door, his nose pressed tightly against the gap. Beneath, sniffing hard. Woof! Woof woof! The bark was sharp, clipped, and urgent. It was not the growl of a threat. It was an alarm, a strange insistence. Luke grabbed the gun by instinct. Flipping the safety off, he moved toward the door, signaling with his hand. Gunnar stepped back, but never took his eyes off the wooden door. "What is it?" Luke whispered. He pressed his ear to the door. Besides the wind howling like a wounded animal, he heard nothing else. But he trusted Gunnar. This dog had once saved his life from a minefield with just a sniff. Luke gripped the cold doorknob. He took a deep breath, then pulled the door violently open. The storm wind slammed into the house like an invisible punch, scattering the papers on the table and whipping up a cloud of dust. White snow rushed in, covering the dark brown floor with a thin layer. Luke squinted, pointing the flashlight out. The feeble yellow beam was swallowed by the thick curtain of snow after only a few meters. No one, only the dark shapes of trees struggling in the storm. He lowered the flashlight, intending to close the door. And then he saw it, a small, pale pink mass huddled right beneath. The three-step threshold. Snow had covered it with a thin layer, making it look like a forgotten stone. Luke's heart skipped a beat. He tossed the gun aside and lunged out into the storm. The -20°C cold bit at his skin like 1,000 needles, but he felt nothing. He knelt down, sweeping the snow off the pink mass with his hand. A child, a little girl. She was lying on her side, her hand still clutching the hem of her coat. Her long hair was matted with melted and frozen snow. Her lips were blue, utterly bloodless. Damn it, Luke swore, the curse instantly swept away by the wind. He slid his hands under the girl, lifting her up. She was feather-light, heartbreakingly light, as if he were holding a broken-winged sparrow, not a human being. Luke rushed back. Inside, kicking the door violently shut to lock the storm outside. He placed the girl on the long sofa. Gunnar rushed forward, licked her cold, limp hand, and then looked up at Luke, whining softly in his throat. I know, Luke muttered, his hands moving quickly and efficiently. He needed to warm her immediately. Luke pulled off her soaked canvas shoes, then the bulky, worn pink puffer coat, half its zipper broken. When the thick coat was removed, Luke froze. Beneath the winter armor, the girl wore only a flimsy cotton summer dress. The dress fabric was frayed at, the hem printed with faded flowers. Her skin was pale blue, covered in goosebumps. But it wasn't the cold that made Luke's stomach clench. On her scrawny wrist, just beneath the short sleeve, was a scar. A crescent-shaped scar, faint but clearly etched against her pale skin. It wasn't a scar from falling off a bike or a playground scrape. It was the scar of impact of a wound that had closed but never vanished. Luke ground his teeth, his jaw hardening. He knew these marks. He had seen them too many times on children in war zones. Children the world had forgotten. He grabbed the thick wool blanket draped over the armchair, the one his mother had been knitting before she died, and wrapped it tightly around the girl. He ran to the kitchen, built a fire. The dry firewood caught quickly, the crackling sounding like tiny applause. The warmth began to spread, chasing away the deadly chill in the room. Luke returned, rubbed his hands vigorously together to warm them, and then pressed them against the girl's cheek. Hey kid, wake up. Can you hear me? No response. Her breathing was shallow and weak, exhaling a faint plume of mist. Gunnar climbed onto the sofa, curling up around her feet. The thick fur and warm body temperature of the large dog became a living blanket. He rested his head on the girl's stomach, his brown eyes staring intently at her small, closed face. For the first time since returning, Gunnar's ears lowered, no longer anxiously pointing toward the door. He had chosen his new object of protection. A minute passed, then two. Time stretched endlessly. Suddenly, the girl shivered violently. Her eyes fluttered open. It was not the look of someone waking from a peaceful sleep. It was the gaze of absolute terror. Her pupils were dilated, glazed over with high fever. She struggled, trying to push the blanket away, mumbling incoherent words. "No, can't." Luke held her shoulder gently, his voice low, trying to reassure her. "You're safe. You're inside a house." But the girl seemed not to see him. She looked right through him, into some fear that was manifesting in her delirium. Her tiny, thin hand gripped Luke's wrist tightly, her nails digging painfully into his skin. "Grandma." Her voice broke, hoarse and desperate. Luke leaned closer. "Where is your mother? What is your name?" She shook her head wildly, tears spilling from the corners of her eyes, rolling down her temples. She didn't call for her mother. She didn't ask to go home. She screamed, a shriek that tore through the room's silence. "Don't take Grandma. I'll be good. I won't eat much. Don't take her." The words dropped into the space like a piece of broken glass. "I won't eat much." Luke froze. A 7 or 8-year-old child should not know how to bargain for their existence with hunger. "Where is your grandmother?" Luke asked again, this time his voice sharper, more urgent. She gasped, her chest heaving violently. Her eyes were vacant, but her hand pointed erratically toward the storm-blackened window. "Car, so cold. She won't wake up? She won't wake up anymore." Then she went limp, her hand dropping, but her fingers still twitching slightly. Luke sprang up. He looked out the window. Only the stark white of the snow and the blackness of the night. But in his mind, the picture had been pieced together. A child in flimsy clothes in the middle of winter, an old scar, and a grandmother lying motionless somewhere out there. He didn't need to think any further. Luke turned to Gunnar. The dog lifted his head, waiting. "Stay here. Watch the girl." Gunnar gave a soft whimper of protest, wanting to follow. But Luke shook his head, pointing definitively at the girl. "Protect." Gunnar lowered his head, resting his chin back on the girl's legs. The order was confirmed. Luke grabbed the flashlight, put on his thick parka coat, and took the field first aid kit. He looked back at the feverish child one last time. Her face was pale under the flickering firelight, looking fragile as a melting snowflake. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know why they were here. But he knew that tonight, his own ghost would have to wait. Because out there, in the midst of this deadly storm, a life was waiting for him to fight death. For it, Luke opened the door. And this time, he plunged into the darkness without hesitation. The storm had subsided, leaving a vast stillness to envelop the forest. The weak morning sun filtered through the door crack, casting dusty shafts of light onto the wooden floor. In the living room, now transformed into a field hospital, Sarah stirred and woke up. She blinked, trying to orient herself. A high pine ceiling, not the low, rusty metal ceiling of the trailer. A thick wool blanket, scented with cedar, was warming her body instead of damp old newspapers. She sat up, and a wave of dizziness made her clutch the edge of the sofa. "Drink this." A deep voice spoke. Luke stood there, holding a mug of warm water and 2 white pills. Sarah flinched instinctively. Drawing back, she looked down at her hands, rough, cracked, with fingernails black from digging for coal and firewood, and quickly hid them beneath the clean blanket. She didn't want to stain this. "Kindness." Thank you, son," she whispered, her voice still trembling from the fever of the night. She held the mug with both hands, trying to keep it from spilling. Luke said nothing, only watched her quietly as she took the medicine. Sarah's gaze drifted across the unfamiliar room, then settled on the bookshelf opposite. On it was a small photo in a glass frame. Luke in uniform, standing straight under the Stars and Stripes flag, a rare smile on his lips. Sarah set the water mug down on the table, her eyes distant and sorrowful. "My son," she murmured, her finger trembling, as she pointed toward the photo. "You were that color too, just like you." Luke turned his head to follow her hand. It was the photo taken on the day he graduated from his special training course. The day he believed he could save the world. "So where is he now?" Luke asked, his voice softening, losing its usual harsh edge. Sarah gave a sad, lopsided smile on her haggard face. "He went on a mission and never came back. They sent me a folded flag and a medal." but a metal doesn't know how to say mommy. Luke was silent. He understood that feeling. The silence of those left behind was more painful than the sound of gunfire on the battlefield. He looked at Sarah, a woman who had lost her son, lost her home, now huddled under his mother's blanket, and suddenly realized why she had trusted a stranger like him last night. That uniform in the photo was not just fabric. It was an invisible link between shared sorrows. By noon, dark clouds had gathered again, covering the sun. A clap of thunder boomed from the valley, shaking the window pane. In the corner of the room, Mia, who was playing with her tattered cloth doll, jumped up in fright. She dropped the doll, covered her head with both hands, and darted under the dining table, coiling into a tiny, small ball. Luke, who was checking the plumbing under the sink, lifted his head. He was about to step over to reassure her, but another shadow was quicker than him. Gunnar, the large dog, with his limping gait, silently crawled into the cramped space under the table. He didn't bark, didn't lick her face. He just lay down, curling his warm body around Mia, forming a furry wall separating her from the outside world. Mia peeked open. Her eyes then timidly wrapped her arms around Gunnar's neck, burying her face in his thick fur. Luke stood motionless, the wrench in his hand hanging loose. That image, the way they huddled together, under the table, it threw him back to a bombing afternoon in Fallujah 3 years ago. When artillery rounds boomed across the sky, he and Gunnar had also huddled like that in a muddy trench. Gunnar had trembled, and he had held him tight, whispering empty promises that everything would be okay. He looked at Mia. This child had no gun, no armor, but she was fighting too. A war with no specific enemy. Only fear, hunger, and abandonment attacking her every day. And Gunnar, the old soldier with psychological scars, had recognized his new comrade. Luke let out a breath, a tight feeling rising in his throat. He turned, walking toward the piano in the living room corner. The photo still lay face down there, covered in a thin layer of dust. He picked it up, turned it over, and placed it neatly on top of the piano, facing the room. His mother's smile appeared, radiant and warm in the late afternoon sun in their garden. She was holding a basket of apples. Her eyes crinkled with laughter. Luke looked into those eyes. He no longer saw the reproach he had imagined for 3 years. He only saw peace. He used his sleeve to gently wipe the dust off the glass. An aroma, a strange but heartbreakingly familiar scent began to permeate the wooden house, waking Luke's empty stomach. The smell of sautéed onions, slightly burnt canned meat, and pungent black pepper. Luke walked into the kitchen. Sarah was standing by the stove, an apron tied around her waist. She moved slowly but expertly, stirring the simmering soup. On the dining table, 3 chip bowls were neatly set out. "Have a seat. It'll be done in a minute," Sarah said without turning around, her voice a little brighter, as if the act of cooking had restored to her some of the dignity of a family's matriarch. Luke sat down. He looked at the bowl of soup in front of him. It was just canned food, mixed with some wilted potatoes and leftover carrots from the cupboard, but the rising steam made it look like a feast. "Eat, don't be shy," Sarah urged, spooning a small amount for Mia, who was sitting on the edge of the chair, her eyes glued to the soup bowl, as if afraid it might disappear. Luke picked up his spoon. By reflex, honed by his military training, he began to scoop continuously, swallowing quickly, barely chewing. Eating to fuel up. Eating to survive. Eating fast before the order to move out. Suddenly, a thin, wrinkled hand gently rested on the back of his spoon-holding hand. Luke flinched, the spoon of soup stopping midair. He looked up. Sarah was looking at him, her eyes gentle, mixed with a hint of sorrow. "Slow down, son," she said softly. "No one's going to take your share. Take your time and eat." Luke's arms stiffened. That sentence, that tone. "Slow down, Luke, you'll choke." That was what his mother used to say whenever he came home from playing football and rushed to the dinner table like a whirlwind. How long had it been since anyone had said that to him? How long had he forgotten that a meal wasn't just about refueling, but about savoring, about sharing? Luke slowly lowered the spoon, back into the bowl. His throat tightened, his eyes stinging and red-rimmed. He bent his head low over the soup bowl to hide this sudden moment of vulnerability. "Yes, thank you, ma'am," he mumbled. The meal continued in silence, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of strangers. There was only the clinking of spoons against bowls and Mia's delicious slurping sounds. Under the table, Gunnar rested his snout on Luke's leg, his tail giving a soft, steady thump against the floor. After dinner, Luke didn't retreat to his room immediately. He went out to the back porch, where there was a pile of discarded old furniture. He pulled out an oak rocking chair, its varnish badly peeled. One of its legs was broken, leaving it listing forlornly. Luke got his toolbox. He sawed, chiseled, and hammered. The steady sound of the hammer echoed in the silent night. He worked meticulously, caring for every grain of wood. An hour later, the chair stood firm again. Luke wiped the sweat from his brow, carried the chair inside, and placed it next to the fireplace, the warmest spot in the living room. Sarah, who was sitting, sewing Mia's torn dress under the warm lamp, looked at him in surprise. "This?" She hesitated. "It was my mother's," Luke said, his voice clipped, but no longer cold. He nudged the chair with his foot. "Try it out. The old chair is too hard, and your back is hurting." Sarah looked at the chair, then at Luke. She understood what he wasn't saying. He wasn't just fixing a chair. He was inviting her to stay, at least in this space, in the memory of this house. He was giving her a family, and also finding a place to return to for himself. She slowly sat down. The chair gave a soft creak, swaying rhythmically. Sarah leaned back, letting out a long, relaxed sigh. She closed her eyes, and for the first time after months of wandering, her face smoothed out into peace. Luke stood leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, watching the scene before him. Mia asleep beside Gunnar, Sarah rocking gently in his mother's chair by the flickering firelight. The fractured pieces of three different lives were somehow beginning to fit together under this roof. Time passed with cruel speed when one began to find peace. The 44th day of his leave came and went, leaving a final night as heavy as lead. Outside, the wind and snow had stopped, but the cold of separation was creeping into every corner of the wooden house. Luke couldn't sleep. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady tick of the wall clock. His luggage was neatly packed in the corner, ready for the early morning trip. Back to the unit. Back to discipline, to guns and bullets, and to familiar solitude. Suddenly, a sharp scream tore through the still night. "No, don't take me, Grandma." Luke sprang up like a coil, grabbed his flashlight, and rushed out of the room. Gunnar was also awake, scratching his claws at the door of the grandmother and granddaughter's room. Luke pushed the door open and stepped in. The flashlight beam swept across the dark room. On the bed, Mia was struggling violently in a nightmare, her forehead drenched in sweat. Sarah sat beside her, holding her granddaughter tight, her hand rhythmically patting the girl's back, humming an old lullaby. But her voice trembled, broken, and under the flashlight, Luke saw silent tears rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. Mia gradually calmed down, her shrieks turning into choked sobs before she sank into a deep, exhausted sleep. Sarah looked up at Luke, her eyes red and swollen. She said nothing, only reached for the worn handbag at the head of the bed. She pulled out a crumpled, quarter-folded piece of paper, offering it to Luke. Luke took it, shining the light on it. It was an official notice from the family court and social services. The cold legal words danced before his eyes. Unfit for custody, no fixed abode, the child will be placed into the state's foster care system. He lowered the paper, looking at Sarah. "If we walk out that door tomorrow," Sarah whispered, her voice choked with despair, "they'll be waiting at the bus stop. They'll take the child to an orphanage or some strange family." She squeezed her frail hands together. "She is all I have left." Luke looked at the sleeping Mia, her small face still etched with fear even in her dreams. Then he looked at Gunnar. The old dog stretched onto the bed, gently licking away the remaining tears on the girl's cheek. A soldier doesn't leave a comrade behind, and a man doesn't abandon his family. Luke folded the paper, tucking it into his breast pocket. He gave Sarah only a firm nod, then turned and walked out, leaving the notice lying still in his pocket, right next to his strongly beating heart. He had made his decision. Dawn broke, bringing the gray light of a bleak winter day. The military jeep was parked outside the gate, its engine idling, puffing white smoke into the air. Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with silence. Sarah had finished packing. 2 plastic bags containing old, tattered clothes lay forlornly by the door. She put on the flimsy coat she had worn on the first day, clutching Mia's hand. They both stood huddled together, like prisoners awaiting the final verdict. Luke emerged from the bedroom. He was in his immaculate uniform, insignia gleaming, his cleanly shaven face looking resolute. He slung his military pack onto his shoulder, taking one last look at the house. Clean, tidy, and warm. He walked past Sarah and Mia, heading straight for the front yard. "Follow me," he called back. The grandmother and granddaughter hurried after him, their footsteps heavy on the soft snow. Luke went to the old oak tree in front of the porch. He pulled a brand-new, long, and sturdy leash from his pocket, tying one end to the wooden stake he had driven in that morning. But he didn't attach the other end to Gunner's neck. He dropped it loosely onto the snow. He turned back, giving a sharp whistle. Gunner ran over, sat down in front of him, tongue lolling out, tail wagging slightly, awaiting orders. Luke knelt down on one knee in the snow, level with Mia's eyes. The girl was looking at him with large, tear-filled eyes, her lips tightly pressed to hold back her tears. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, shiny metal object, a dog training whistle. He placed it in Mia's small, cold palm. "Listen up, Private," Luke said, his voice as serious as if issuing a tactical mission. "Gunner can't come with me anymore. His leg hurts, he's old. He needs a fireplace, a soft bed, and most importantly," he paused, looking deep in her eyes, "he needs a new commander." Mia's eyes widened. She looked at the whistle, then at Gunner, then back at Luke. Me? She stammered. "Can you do it?" Luke asked, not doubting, but challenging. Mia took a deep breath, nodding fiercely. "Yes, sir. I promise." Luke smiled, ruffling her soft hair. He stood up, turning to Sarah. She was standing there, hand covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face uncontrollably. Luke took his key ring off his belt. The key ring had a small wooden tag carved with the word home. He stepped toward her, placed it in Sarah's trembling hand, and held her hand tightly for a moment. "My mother," her name was Evelyn, Luke said, his voice lowering, uncharacteristically soft. "She hated silence. She liked listening to jazz in the evening, the old vinyl kind. Would you help me play some music for her?" Sarah looked at the key ring in her hand, then at the young man before her. She understood. This was not charity. This was a request. He wasn't giving her a home out of pity. He was asking her to preserve the soul of this place. He was giving her a family, and also finding a place to return to for himself. Thank you, Luke," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I promise. This fire will never go out." Luke nodded, releasing her hand. He turned and walked quickly toward the jeep, not looking back. He was afraid if he looked, he wouldn't be able to leave. He climbed into the car, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, the tires rolling over the stark white snow. When the car had driven some distance, Luke finally dared to glance into the rearview mirror. The small wooden house receded into the distance, but it was no longer a desolate tomb burying painful memories. Smoke was rising straight up into the gray sky from the chimney. Warm yellow light spilled out from the window, and on the porch, 3 small figures were standing there. Sarah had his mother's red wool shawl draped over her shoulders. Gunner sat solemnly, his chest puffed out with pride. And next to him, Mia was puffing out her cheeks, blowing the silent whistle, waving frantically toward him. Gunner lifted his head to the sky, barking a long farewell, woof, 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 the sound echoing through the mountains strong and proud. Luke smiled. A genuinely relieved smile spread across his face, smoothing the harsh lines around his eyes. He reached out and turned on the radio. Classical jazz. Music filled the car, soothing and gentle. He was still a soldier on assignment. But this time, he knew what he was fighting for. And more importantly, he knew there was a fire still burning, waiting for his return.